Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. This week, Daily Commercial News staff writers Don Wall, Angela Gismondi, and myself attended the Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships Conference in Toronto. And I'd like to sum up some of our coverage from the week, which you can read on both the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. Angela reported on a fireside chat format session that opened the conference between CCPPP President and CEO Lisa Mitchell and Peter Fragiskatos, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities. He said the housing challenge will be with conference attendees and the industry for years, and added that, quote, tying housing to infrastructure, I think, is something you're going to continue to see the government emphasize. We will continue to work with the private sector to bring their knowledge and their abilities to the fore to get those results, end quote. Don reported on another fireside chat session focusing on the Ontario nuclear sector, featuring Pat Dalzell of Bruce Power and Atkins Realist nuclear sector executive Andrea Elzenier. Dalzell said Bruce Power is, as he termed it, technology agnostic, and added that as Bruce Power prepares for a significant period of planning for its future builds, its track record with recent refurbishments will be a major selling point. El Nazir said messages P3 advocates and investors should take away from the conference are that nuclear projects are multi-year, which brings certainty in terms of the supply chain, partnerships, and government approvals, and that Ontario's two major producers have gained experience not only in building and operating the facilities in the first place, but also in undertaking refurbishments. I also have a story from the conference about a panel looking at American moves into the P3 space as less of a threat and more of an opportunity. Goldman Sachs Vice President Christopher Elmore noted that Canada has a smaller but high probability pipeline where projects tend to go ahead, whereas the American P3 space is much larger, but many projects never end up putting shovels in the ground. Lisa Mitchell moderated the panel and added, quote, we've focused on the social side of infrastructure while the U.S. is focused on the civil side. So I think there's opportunities there for us to learn. Revenue demand risk is something that they've been doing, and we have less experience in that, end quote. We also have a summary of all the national awards for innovation and excellence in P3 award winners, and make sure to check out the previous episode of the Construction Record Podcast, where I spoke with both Lisa Mitchell and Infrastructure Ontario President and CEO Michael Lindsay. Up next, we have an interview with Interact Analysis Senior Research Director Alistair Hayfield about the downturn in the European heavy equipment market and what that indicates more broadly, as well as an interview with Jacob Brothers President and CEO Scott Jacob about leadership in times of ongoing crises. Enjoy. Recently wrote a paper about how heavy equipment sales are at a downturn in Europe, and generally the economy is not looking great. I would go from not great to could be better, but maybe you're the expert. You tell me, why is heavy equipment in a downturn, and what are sort of the overriding factors causing this and for the greater economy?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's a really interesting time to be covering the market because we've just had this really unusual period, right? We've had COVID, and then coming off the back of that, we've sort of gone straight into the Ukraine conflict, and all of that has led to some, very kind of unusual performances in the equipment market. So, you sort of had this shutdown globally during the early phases of COVID. Then countries came out of that. You had people kind of picking up construction projects again. You had funding from governments to try and help boost economies and get out of COVID. You then had supply chain crisis. Not enough semiconductors or parts for equipment. That sort of weighed heavy. And then Ukraine happened, and so then you have kind of messing up of energy prices and sort of again of availability of components and impacting costs for construction companies and agricultural companies, and so we're coming out of this very sort of unstable period. But where we find ourselves going into 2024 is that in Europe, we still have persistently high inflation. It's coming back down, but versus the historic level of low 1 or 2% that we've been used to for the last 10 years, it's much higher. As a result, most central banks have pushed up interest rates, and that is having an impact on the cost of mortgages, and it's having an impact on consumer discretionary spending, and all of that is basically meaning that The housing market is slowing down. People are, less likely to be, buying houses right now, and so for the house building sector, we're expecting a slowdown through the remainder of 2023 into 2024, right across Europe in most instances, and so construction equipment companies, contractors, are probably not going to be in a position to want to buy as much new equipment next year as they have done in the last couple of years. If they are lacking projects to work on, they'll be having a decision about whether they can make do with the equipment that they have, or if they need some extra equipment, whether they rent it as opposed to buying it. So we think that some of those economic conditions are sort of acting as a weight on the market. We also see a slowdown in some civil engineering, kind of larger construction projects as well. Again, concerns over costs, pushing some of those projects to be delayed or possibly scaled back. And again, that will provide a sort of weight on the construction equipment market right across Europe. Again, there aren't many places that are going to be immune from this. So yeah, it's for kind of listeners, it's common economic factors that you're probably hearing about in your own lives, but played out a little bit larger and for the construction equipment market.
And just in terms, I mean, the European market is, I think, the third biggest in the world. It's certainly a powerful force. And so how much of this is due to external stuff affecting Europe, and how much of this stuff happening in Europe will affect externally, like say North America or Asia or other areas of the world?
So in terms of demand, demand we actually think will stay reasonably good in North America for equipment. So manufacturers who are exposed to North America, or have a global presence, they might find that business softens in Europe, but they might find that they still are able to grow, or things are not so bad because they've kind of got business in North America. China continues to be a weak point, and it was a very large market before COVID. It still hasn't recovered from kind of the sort of shutdown that it had there, and levels of equipment sales in China are much lower than they have been historically, and so that will not be good news for kind of international brands that are exposed to that market. That's still going to be a softness for them. What that is doing, though, is it's pushing domestic Chinese manufacturers to really aggressively pursue export opportunities. So what we are starting to see is kind of quite rapid increases in market shares for some of the Chinese construction equipment brands in Southeast Asia, Latin America. In Western Europe, we're starting to see quite a big push, and to date, we've not seen much in North America, but I would expect that to change as well, because those companies like Sany or XCMG or Dugong are very, very aggressively kind of pursuing the export opportunities to kind of make up for the shortfall in their own domestic market.
Now, I'm betting you're sick and tired of answering this question, but how much, if anything, does Brexit affect this? Because it's no longer part of the European market, but I would assume there's still a lot of back and forth, or has that kind of worked itself out over the last 8 years or however long it's been since Brexit came in?
I mean, from a European perspective, I don't think it particularly impacts the sort of continental European market that much. Yes, there's quite a bit of equipment manufactured in the UK that goes into Europe, but it's relatively frictionless trade, and I think any of the kind of issues with supply chain have more or less been ironed out now. So I don't think that that's really a particularly big issue. I don't think it's been a particularly big issue at any point really. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't think for the construction equipment market it makes too much of a difference. Other than, you know, potentially there might be some divergence in the future over, you know, emissions legislation or the approach, you know, with how quickly, you know, construction decarbonizes in the UK versus what happens in mainland Europe. And
Right.
access to labor could still be an issue, right? So we see that in the UK that much like everywhere else, there is labor shortage for the
Mm-hmm.
construction sector. And, you know, where pre-Brexit we had kind of unfettered access to workers from across Europe, that's gone away, and that is an issue for the, you know, the British construction sector. But that's a, you know, it's a British only issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Right.
you know,
Right.
I don't think that necessarily plays out in the rest of Europe.
And we mentioned Ukraine. Let's say, and I think pretty much everybody on this call and otherwise in the Western world wants them to win this conflict. But if they do, well, let's say when they do win, I would assume that would mean there'd be a big rush of equipment into there to rebuild. And how would that affect the economy in terms of like supply for other projects?
I mean, very good question. I don't think I've kind of thought too much about that. Yes, I suspect there would be a push to rebuild, and that would be a, you know, a kind of local positive for that market. In terms of availability of supply, I wouldn't see that there would be an issue at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that um, Ukraine sort of coming on tap and being a growth market would necessarily mean that there's a shortage of equipment. I mean, I suspect you might find that quite a bit of that equipment comes from China,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and there's probably, I don't imagine that there's a shortage. As I said, earlier, I think a lot of the companies in China are looking for export
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
opportunities.
Right. And that'd be one.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and they have the capacity to deal with it. So I don't, I don't think any growth in Ukraine would necessarily mean that there would be a shortage of equipment anywhere else.
And I guess finally, I would ask if we can go out a little further past 2024, where do you see this all heading? Or is it just too chaotic to figure it out from this point?
Um, I would expect to see kind of signs of recovery towards the back end of 2024 and going into 2025. I think the impact of central banks raising their interest rates will bring down the kind of headline rate of inflation. And so I think as that comes down, we'll start to see those interest rates be brought back, and I think that will mean that, you know, borrowing will become cheaper, more affordable, and we'll start to see, you know, housing market pick up again, and we'll start to see, you know, bigger construction projects start again. And I think also one important sector we've not talked about is, you know, it's big manufacturing base in Europe, and that's going to
Mhm.
have a bad 2024, but that's probably going to pick up again as well, as we move into 2025. So I would sort of expect to see slowdown next year, then gradual recovery through 2025 and 2026. And, you know, in reality, there's, I don't want to say that this is a market that's going to grow forever, but there does continue to be a push for more and more construction equipment. And, you know, particularly as we see kind of labor shortages for construction, it's you know, it's likely that machinery will play a part in, you know, kind of helping to address some of those kind of shortages in labor as well. So I think, you know, I'm relatively optimistic about the, you know, the kind of midterm to long term. I think we just need to get through this period of sort of kind of financial instability at the moment, and back to some sort of more normal level of interest rates and inflation.
Okay, thanks for joining us today, Alistair.
No problem. My pleasure.
I'm here with
Scott Jacob from Jacob Brothers Construction.
And we just came out of a session you did at the ICBA Innovation Summit, all about dealing with crises and
crises and crises to come. So at first, you said you weren't controversial because you held back, but you definitely were the most colorful because you said that the pandemic was the biggest oh shit moment of your life. So maybe you could explain that statement.
Yeah, I think the pandemic happened to all of us really quickly. Nobody was prepared for it. Nobody had training on how to deal with how to run a business through a pandemic, and you had to go fast. I think that's the part that gets forgotten. The pandemic was long; it dragged on, but for us, the first 7 to 10 days was just fast. Things that were normal and things that you could go to the bank with and count on changed overnight through the pandemic. So that was what I meant by oh shit. We care a lot about our people. Keeping people working matters. If you park a machine, you park a machine. There's a cost, but it's a soft cost. If you park people, there's significant hurt. So we worked really hard to make sure we could pivot. I don't love the word, but we leveraged the fact that we're a relatively small mid-tier. We're 350, 400 people, but we were able to pivot quickly and keep people working. I think that was the biggest sense of relief we had. And then I'm passionate that my brother and I made the decision to manage the risk. We didn't hide from the risk. We didn't send people home, and respectfully to those that did. That was a good plan for some. For us, it wasn't. We knew what shutting down was going to look like. We had no idea what starting again was. So our approach, I think, was a little bit unique. We just said, hey, the construction industry is filled with risks, and we don't run away from them. We don't not go in manholes because it's dangerous. We find a way to understand the risk and manage it. So that was our approach to COVID, and our people did a great job. We had one person leave through the entire pandemic, and we didn't lose a day. We didn't close the office for a single day. And we were very passionate, my brother and I, that if we expected the sites to continue to work, then head office better as well.
Right. So people were coming into the office, or it was just being managed remotely?
No, we had a 100% attendance at the office. We still do.
Okay.
We had absolutely... We had a fairly large office, and we had the ability to separate people.
Exactly. Yeah. I was wondering about that.
We put up the screens. We did all the things that other people eventually did to have a safe workplace. We just chose to do it right from the beginning.
Okay.
And our staff were terrific. They all played ball. They all took it seriously, and we got through it.
And one of the comments you made, which is also quite colorful, was the supply chain is like Russian roulette now. Yes. I'm really simplifying. Maybe you could explain it better than that.
Yeah, I mean, again, pre-pandemic, and somebody made the point, it wasn't me, that supply chain issues didn't happen right away, and I think that's absolutely true. I think many people in the industry use supply chain issues as the excuse early on, but supply chain issues really did hit the industry somewhere in that 12 to 18 months. Things like cement weren't available, in many cases lumber, steel wasn't. I think the world has changed forever. I think we went into the with this attitude, with just in time. Like we were all trying to do more just in time. Maybe we were taking pages out of the Japanese automotive industry. And so the whole idea was close, small warehouses and just buy everything you need just in time. I think that's changed forever. There's just too much risk. We buy materials and we source goods on the world stage. If we've learned anything through the pandemic and then more recent crisis, geopolitical things. If you have it on the ground a week or a month before you need it, you're going to be better served than if you're buying it, trying to get it just in time.
Besides that, what do you think we have learned from the pandemic and these other crises, and what haven't we yet? Because you referred to old style thinking that people are falling back on as well.
I hope we've learned to appreciate each other more. That would be, I'm not sure if that's an observation or a hope, but I think we appreciate each other more. I also think we've learned that, bad things can happen. I mean, things can go wrong. People do get hurt. And so I think our eyes are all our eyes a little more wide open. And I don't think we take things for granted like we used to do. So those would be my key ones.
What would be the ones that people still haven't kind of figured out yet or are politely ignoring, in fact?
Yeah, I mean, I'm deeply concerned about the spending associated with COVID, and the spending associated with COVID and the pandemic has gone on to be just non-pandemic related spending. So it's become socially acceptable to run deficit budgets. I worry about that deeply. Affordability is a big issue. We have to figure that out, and it's real simple. What you want to get directly influences the price you pay. So if you like the rotating chandelier under the Granville Street Bridge, you have to stop and understand that got paid for by not the developer or the contractor, but by the people that bought those units. So little things like that. I think we got a lot of work to do there. I worry about affordability.
And just in terms of risk, there's been a lot. That's basically the main thing that's been talked about all through this conference. So maybe you could address, like, I guess they were talking about models that don't seem to work anymore in terms of that, and they did before, or maybe didn't, but people went through it with them anyway.
Yeah, so I'm bearing in mind I'm primarily a public infrastructure guy, and for the most part, public infrastructure, it's fixed price contracting. So the owner decides what he wants to build. He works with a design consultant to specify it, and sometimes the quantities. But you basically enter into a fixed price contract. So you say, I'll build that bridge for $10 million. And under life as we knew it pre-pandemic, you allow for a certain amount of volatility in fuel prices or truck prices or 2x4 prices. In today's world, you can get massive swings, and it's just not possible to predict them accurately. And so what do? You're either a sloppy contractor and you guess low and you get yourself in trouble, which doesn't serve the public well, or you guess high. If you ask me to guess, I'm going to understand the risk. If I have to guess what it's going to cost, I'm going to guess high. And simplest example I give you is fuel. I run machinery every day. So what's diesel going to cost in 2 years' time when I build a piece of highway? I don't know, but it could be $250. So am I going to put it in at $250 or whatever we're paying today? And the answer is I put it in at $250, and then I put a markup on it, pay tax on it, and suddenly projects are unaffordable. So that's the kind of risk thing. So you could say, well, what could we do differently? There are lots of different models out there where the owner shares in that risk. So they could give you a benchmark price for fuel, for instance, and if it fluctuates by more than 1%, 5%, 10%, the owner carries that risk.
Right.
And you might say, well, why would the owner want to do that? If the owner carries the risk, he's going to pay less for the risk than in this new contract.
Right. Okay.
And if a sloppy contractor gets to assess the risk, he'll bid it at zero, and then scream like murder and argue he wants compensation later. So
we talked about technology and innovation, and I can't remember if it was you or not, but somebody said innovation doesn't necessarily have to mean technology.
Yes. Yeah. That was me. And again, I'm fundamentally, I move dirt for a living. I've said that, and that's really what we do. My point is, it doesn't always have to be fancy. Sometimes there is no magical solution. Sometimes it doesn't come out of a box, plug in, and make your life better. Sometimes it's just about working harder, working smarter. Sometimes it's about grinding through. But for me, innovation means challenge everything. Things that were norm or things you were taught by your parents 40 years ago may or may not be applicable. And be open-minded. Look at them and say, are we doing this because it makes sense, or can we innovate and do it differently?
But there is you're not averse to technology either.
Not averse to technology. I'm probably showing my age by not embracing it any more than I do. I just think technology for the sake of technology isn't necessarily the answer. And again, there's lots of great things in industry that make life better, but there are some other things that I think are just Pandora's box. Sometimes technology allows us to do more or create more data. But if there's no return on the data, what's the point?
Right.
So
I guess I'd end with you were supposed to give this 30-second sum up of so let's do that here. That's what you did at the end of the panel.
30-second sum up. So I'm passionate about the construction industry, and I encourage people that are in it to stay in it. I encourage young people that are looking for an exciting career to give it a try. It's hard work. It's never going to be the easiest way to fill a day, but it's fulfilling. There's great people in the industry. And there's a chance to do really well for yourself financially. So hang in there, be tough, and grind through it.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, you're welcome.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can listen to us on Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify, as well as on the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.